So hey everybody, this is the Investigative Role-Playing Masterclass panel. I am Robin D. Laws, and for the purpose of this panel, I am best known as the designer of the Gumshoe rules engine, which is designed explicitly to solve the problems of investigative play. And some of the Gumshoe games I have designed include the Esoterrorists and the Yellow King role-playing game, which I'll be running a couple of sessions of later.
Woo-hoo. I'm Lynn Hardy. I am the Associate Line Editor for Call of Cthulhu for Chaosium. So yeah, I kind of do a lot of things with investigative games as my day job.
And I'm Kat Tobin. I'm the co-owner and managing director of Pelgrane Press, the publisher of, among other things, the Gumshoe system. So also responsible for a lot of investigative role-play production.
So usually when I run this, the covert mission of the panel becomes the overt mission of the panel, and I talk about how Gumshoe works and how that in particular addresses the problems of investigative play. And the awesome thing about Gumshoe is that even if you're not playing Gumshoe, you can steal many, if not all, of its tenets and apply them to another game, and that may result in some balancing, juggling that you might want to do, but I think would be rewarding nonetheless. So the ethos of Gumshoe is that it is never interesting to fail to get information. There are other situations in role-playing, of course, where it is equally interesting to fail as to succeed. So if you're running away from the Shoggoth and you come up against the chain link fence, it is interesting whether you climb the fence or not. More horrible if you don't, but interesting either way. However, if you need to get the information that takes you to the alleyway with the chain link fence where you had to go to get the scepter, after which the Shoggoth comes and chases you, and you don't get there, that is not interesting. And so what Gumshoe does is it divides abilities into investigative abilities and general abilities. General abilities include running away from Shoggoths. The skill is not called that, but there is one that does that. It's athletics. Yeah, it depends on how specialized a game you want to have. Yes, escape Shoggoth. But the investigative skills, the way they work is if you have them and you describe yourself looking for the piece of information in the right way, you get the information and can then move on. And sometimes people who are familiar with other games look at that and they say, well, don't people just shout out everything on their character sheet? And it's like, no, they don't do that because that would be weird. This is exactly the same thing as you in regular Call of Cthulhu, where you do library use roll. In Trail of Cthulhu, you use your library use skill. All you do is you skip the roll part. Mm-hmm. That's it. And it's in play is exactly the same. But what that allows is a mystery that then becomes not about whether you have permission to move from one scene to the other, but rather you get a whole bunch of information and then you have to figure out what matters, what's really going on, what is cool but irrelevant information, how do you sift those things out? And the result is that it creates a richer mystery that is more like how actual investigators deal with mysteries in the real world, which is often they have way too much information and they're trying to sift through them and sort them out. Lynn, so that is my number one piece of advice is never withhold clues. And if you're playing Call of Cthulhu instead of Trail of Cthulhu, you can just do that too. You can skip the rolls, and there's no great penalty for doing so. And you can sometimes use library use for other things, like convincing the librarian to look the other way while you steal the Necronomicon. That's a perfectly sound use of that ability.
Completely, yeah.
Interesting if you fail, as well as interesting if you succeed. So Lynn, how do you approach investigative scenarios when you're building them? Because the structure of an investigative scenario has to be much tighter necessarily with particular logic.
Yes, it does, because you have to have that flow through of logic. You have to have those clues there for people to find. And as Robin was saying, I mean, a lot of people have looked at Call of Cthulhu and gone, oh, but if I fail the roll, I'm not going to get the information. Well, it never really was entirely that, but we know a lot of people were very, sticklers for it. So one of the things we've tried to address with 7th edition is going, well, if you are going to use your library use roll, as Robin said, one example is it's convincing the librarian to look the other way while you rifle through the restricted collection, or it's how long does it take you to find that particular piece of information, which might be, if you're in a time-sensitive, time-critical situation, that could have a knock-on effect. But in terms of the structure, you've got to think very carefully about where the information is, how much information you're providing, does it all link together, does it point where you think it points? Because you can guarantee that your players will get totally the wrong end of the stick and go off in a completely different direction. You also have to be reasonably flexible with where the clues are. So make sure that there's more than one place that they can get them, particularly in the Call of Cthulhu game, which isn't quite as tightly structured in terms of the sort of like the flow chart thing that appears in the Gumshoe games. So if there is a critical piece of information and it's here, but your players suddenly get really interested in something you've not organised for over there, make sure that it's movable. So it's like a floating clue. It can go wherever you need it to for them to find whenever they need it. But you do have to have that underlying pathway that all ties together and all makes sense. And that's actually quite a tricky thing to do. So read Agatha Christie, assiduously, and any other good mystery writer to sort of have a look to see how they structure it, and little red herrings and interesting things that can add flavour and texture that help support the plot but don't necessarily feed directly into it. Have you read the article where someone was analysing Agatha Christie stories? Which is fascinating, the fact that there's always 3 plots in an Agatha Christie story. There's your core plot, there's your subplot that is meant to confuse you and misdirect you to who's actually doing the bad guy behind plot A, then there's the romantic subplot, which usually involves possibly the person from B who's the red herring for being the murderer as well. So, not all players are going to want that romantic subplot, but, it's not stealing, it's paying homage.
It's structural analysis.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Kat, you've developed a ton of scenarios written by various writers for Gumshoe over the years. What do you think stands out as something that makes an investigative scenario stand out over others?
I think, like Lynn was saying, the ability to take a clue, which is a vital piece of information that the players need, and transfer it from place to place is a really useful skill to develop when you're building investigative adventures. Because, like Lynn said, if you say to your players, oh, let's all go to the haunted house now and get the clues from there, guarantee you the players are going to be like, oh, but that shopkeeper we met like 3 sessions ago, he was really funny. How about we go back and talk to him instead? So you need to be able to transfer that clue from place to place. But you also need to have a really clear understanding of what the vital information is. Like, if they don't get that clue, if they don't go to that haunted house and they don't pick up those documents or whatever, can they still get to the end? Are there alternate sources where they can find that same information that's in those documents? So even if you can't transfer the clue, you can transfer the information in the clue. And I think that having that flexibility in your adventure makes it feel less linear to people, because the players feel like they have the capacity to explore the world, to go anywhere they want to in the world, and there are consequences, and they will discover things wherever in their world you go. So I think that kind of branching ability is really important.
Because that gives the players a sense that that what they do matters, that they're not just being led by the nose through a script, but that who they talk to and in what order
is relevant,
makes a difference.
And meaningful. And I think meaningful choices are one of the key things that keep players engaged in a game.
Yeah, and even if it's only an illusion of agency, it still feels like agency. So that's very important to keep your players invested in the game, is that, as Robin said, Kat said, they feel like they have control over where the story's going. They're not just going through the motions of something you set in front of them.
One question that is very often asked at an investigative panel is, what about red herrings? And often the answer, people think, well, like Agatha Christie, I've got to put a red herring in my story. I've got a whole other fake plot. And sometimes some of the Gumshoe adventures have red herrings, but they're not really red herrings in that sense, because your players are the red herrings, and their lack of understanding of what's going on will supply all the misdirection that you require. And in fact, often your challenge is not to further confuse the players, but to deconfuse them. And so when you have an element that is, because obviously you don't want it to be obvious right from the jump who the sinister scientist is or who the murderer is, but to make sure that all of the side elements that in a Christie novel would be flat out red herrings, in fact, lead you back to the path.
Yeah.
So, if the werewolves are actually, not guilty of the murders, they're werewolves, not swearwolves, that they have some bit of information that points back to the sinister scientist and can help you move back to where you're headed along that path. When we did Cthulhu Confidential, we learned a lot about mystery structure because that really distills it down. So that Gumshoe 1-to-1 is the version of investigative play that's tuned for one GM and one player, and feels a lot more like a mystery novel, because it's very intense. Both the GM and the player are on stage all at one time. Maybe you could talk a bit more about the experience of that and what it tells us about investigative play.
Yeah, I think that Robin ran a session of that very early on in the development for me and also for my business partner Simon, and it was my first time kind of playing a one player, one GM game, and it was so completely different, particularly with regard to the investigative aspect of it. So I'm really accustomed to group, to there being a group around a table. If you gather up some clues, if you get information, if you talk to NPCs, then you end up with this big bundle of information and everyone sits around and kind of goes, right, okay, so I think next we should go here and talk to this person, or I think we should follow up on this more. In a one-to-one game, you don't have that. It's like if you haven't taken a note of the information in the game, there's nobody else to go, oh, but remember, we were also supposed to go and do that. So there's a lot of pressure on you to I was frantically writing down everything Robin said to make sure that information wasn't lost. But also the intensity of it means that there is no fresh input coming in outside of what the GM is providing. There are no other players to bounce ideas off. You don't have that collaborative, the working together to get a lot of different kind of suggestions about what the best course of action is. You don't have a choice of courses of action. You've only got what you can come up with yourself. And it's a very, very different style of play. And like Robin said, you really feel like you're either you as the player are on or the GM is on. Somebody is on all the time. It's very relentless, very intense. And you really do feel like the protagonist in the Cthulhu Confidential setting is a noir setting. So you're kind of a lone detective, against the world and everything is terrible. And you really do feel like the pressure of that noir world kind of closing in on you as you frantically try and put together the clues. So yeah, it's a very different flavor of, you wouldn't think that just playing, because it's very similar kind of conceptually, I guess, and informationally to Trail of Cthulhu or Cthulhu Gumshoe game. But the feel of the play is completely different. Yeah, it's really interesting.
And it leaves out the sort of faffing about where the players are all sort of speculating without having information. Yeah. One of the things that you will probably need to do as an investigative GM is to keep your players collecting more information rather than all debating what could be happening. It's well, yes, it could be lich vampires from Venus, or you could find out. You could go find out. Ask. Another sort of quirk to look out for is often the players want to find information through impersonal means over personal means. That it's well, can we just steal his laptop? It's and then sit there boringly going through the laptop for an hour? No, you have to go and talk to people. And that issue is doubled when the scenario calls for you to talk to somebody scary. So in one of the Cthulhu Confidential scenarios, the one that I ran for Cat, you have to eventually go and talk to the real-life LA gangster Mickey Cohen, sort of at the beginning of his career when he's still working for Bugsy Siegel. And Bugsy Siegel is also someone you can go and talk to. And both of those people are in real life terrifying, and it turns out they're much more scary than any shoggoths could possibly be, because they're real life gangsters, and you're alone in the situation. And so I ran that scenario again and again and again, and every time people went off, they wanted to talk to the cultists up on the hill, who they don't necessarily, they have some information, but you got to talk to Mickey Cohen, and they didn't want to do it. Yeah. So you may also, that's a fun thing to play with, but you have to know that that's a dynamic where, and it's often, very, because players often try to avoid the tense situations that real life, or not real life, but fictional detectives have to encounter to get through problems. Lynn, are there sort of other kind of tips that you've learned from developing or writing or playtesting particular adventures?
If you can do it, one of the funnest experiences is to actually let the players decide who the bad guy is. I did it once with the Dying Earth one that we did. So it was, and it's kind of tricky, but you sort of set it up so that it could be any one of a number of people, and then you go where the players want you to go. Now, if you can pull that off, it's an amazing experience. And the funniest one when we did that, because I ran it a few times, was they actually ended up fitting somebody up because it was in their political interest to let the person that they knew had actually done it get away with it. So there was a fall guy that they framed to protect this other person. So, if you can...
Dying Earth characters wouldn't do that.
No, they wouldn't do that at all.
Yes, they would.
So that's really good. But as Robin said, people do get strange. We actually had this as feedback for the Berlin book, was that the players were far more freaked out by actual Weimar Berlin than they were by the Cthulhu mythos. It was very much a case of, oh, thank God it's a mythos creature. Well, we know how to deal with that. Yeah. That's okay. Be flexible. Respond to your players. If they are finding it a bit too much, maybe back off and move the clue if you can. But the whole thing is, this is a game. It's still meant to be enjoyable for them and for you too. And if they're really stressing out about going to a particular place to get something, be flexible, see if you can move it around a bit. Don't force them into doing something that is really going to make them desperately uncomfortable as players.
Yeah, I think a thing that Robin did, which is actually, I'm pretty sure, in the Cthulhu Confidential book as GM advice, when I was playing, because I was getting a little bit kind of anxious about whether I had all the right information. And it's just a useful GMing tip, I think, when you're, tying into what Lynn said, when you're running investigative games, is to remind the players what information they have, right? Because players get so much information from an adventure, and they, like Robin said, it's a matter of sifting through it and working out what the important things are. So just kind of say to them, well, remember you did talk to that shop clerk, and the shop clerk told you this thing, and you haven't followed up on that yet. And it just kind of opens up another avenue of investigation for them. And I think that, role-playing kind of 20 years ago was it was very much a kind of a GM versus the players. You had your GM screen, you did all your roles behind it. But I think that we've come to a much more collaborative storytelling. We're all working together to have fun and to tell a good story. So just, remind your players of what information they have that's relevant or that they haven't followed up on, and, kind of say to them, well, maybe you might want to check that thing out, But I think it's perfectly okay to work with them to help them solve the mystery, rather than have it be a kind of a, haha, I have all the clues and you have nothing.
In-house refer to that as as a seasoned investigator technique,
yes, exactly.
Which is the person you're playing is a seasoned investigator. They know what they're doing, and the person playing them is not. Yeah. And so you can guide them along in a way that doesn't break the fourth wall quite as strongly as you otherwise would, by just saying, well, as a seasoned investigator, of course, you remember that you look back at your notes and you see, oh yeah, I forgot to investigate the tuna factory. That's something that I still have to do. And that's non-invasive. It doesn't, and of course you only do that when you can tell the person needs a little help, and where, in another situation where they might feel, oh, you're kind of railroading me down to the tuna factory. If they're genuinely lost, it's like, oh, thanks, right, of course, the tuna factory, that's good. And you can also, I would advise, when the player seems to be doing something weird or dumb, stop and ask why. why are you walking into the wood chipper? Don't you remember there's a wood chipper there? And often the problem is that the player has come to envision something else going on quite differently than you. And what they're doing is not stupid, it's just based on a misunderstanding of the traditional bottleneck of information in GM.
And I think as well, like the way investigative abilities work in the gumshoe system means that you can always give people more information and more direction if they need it. So like Robin was saying, you can just kind of say, oh, well, not just as a seasoned investigator, but like, because you have the architecture skill, for example, like, that this building, there is something not quite right about it. It seems to be a lot bigger on the outside than it is on the inside. Maybe that's something worth looking into. So it allows you to funnel in like relevant information to the players in a way that the game actually supports and is designed to develop.
Yeah. And it was alluded to earlier, but obviously with Call of Cthulhu, yes, there's the dice rolling to get information. But if it's really critical information to the plot, don't roll the dice. Just give it to them. Make them think they've worked for it, but don't roll. You don't need to roll. This is about the story. Rolling's only fun if it's dramatically appropriate and there's going to be consequences for failing that roll.
Are there people here who are interested in writing investigative scenarios for publication, or are we all GMs? We're all GMs, okay. I guess at this point, we can start opening it up for questions, because this is a masterclass format. So does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask?
It's okay, we've all been fed this morning. I mean, I know it's coming on to lunchtime, but we promised not to bite.
So one type of red herring I bumped into is kind of sideline, bittersweet investigative line, which leads the characters to do some really great things and helping somebody out. The only thing, it wasn't really related to the main plot line. I've seen this used in some TV series. Have you ever tried this in a role-playing game scenario, and has it worked out or not?
So this is a sort of a side element that allows them to do something that provides an emotional upbeat or some other thing.
So they help somebody out or something like this, but it's still not bringing them closer to the main. So it works in a TV series.
Mm-hmm. Right. And the reason you do that in a TV series is because you're trying to give that character more spotlight and to show something about that character and allow them to appear in a positive light. And some of the Gumshoe games suggest that you have sort of personal subplots that go along with the mystery. So, for example, the Ashen Stars game does that because the science fiction shows that it's based on, like Star Trek, is a cop show, basically, in space, where they go and they solve a mystery and they encounter a moral dilemma. They figure out what to do with the moral dilemma. But with the newer Trek shows, like from Next Generation on, they also always have sort of a personal B-plot, just the way that Agatha Christie intertwines things. And so you might look for ways to frame those sort of side sequences as things that highlight something about the character. So you might have something that's particularly tailored to one of the characters, and you might think, who hasn't had a lot of spotlight time in this scenario so far? Oh, well, Jane seems kind of sidelined because it's mostly sciencey things they're doing, and she's, has more of the interpersonal skills. Well, maybe she finds, someone in the museum who is looking distressed, and she can go and inquire into that, and that can give that player something to do, just the way that the scripts are often about giving an actor something to do, and give that player a sense of participation and an upbeat, and also something that underlines something about that character.
Yeah, I think as well as what Robin said, another useful thing to do is, it might be something you're already doing, but up front, before you start your game, sit the players down, have like a session 0, and ask them what their goals are for the game. Like, ask them what kind of play they're interested in, because different players have different expectations from a game, and they have different preferences in terms of how the play works. So some players are like, I just want to chase the plot, I just want to get the clues, solve the mystery, yes. Whereas some players are like, I want to explore the world, I want to go talk to people and meet new and interesting NPCs, And I think there is space in particularly in a longer campaign, for both of those players to feel fulfilled. But it does require having, almost like you said, two different plots going on. And I think the resolution of more of an interpersonal plot, or like more what you'd call a subplot that isn't the same, it doesn't need to feel like a subplot or like something secondary to the main action unless you frame it that way. Like if you're sitting there going, right, well, it's nice that we're helping this, person, but like the session's ending in half an hour and we still haven't, gone to the tuna factory. That tuna factory, it's starting to smell. Let's move on. It's a matter of kind of framing it.
In fact, some might say it's fishy.
Oh, that was terrible.
That was.
So I think framing it, like understanding that different players have different expectations, knowing upfront what the players' goals are for their character, like how they want their character arc to play out, I think will help you to understand whether that kind of action is a diversion from the main plot, or whether it's a particular player's main plot, whether that's the thing in the game that they're interested in. So that way you can kind of frame it appropriately.
And of course you can use all of that, as they do in the TV shows, to help develop the atmosphere, to support the main story. So it doesn't have to be a total side quest that's got nothing to do with it. You can always feed it back, so that there's always, perhaps it's just sort of a similar kind of structure, or it's not necessarily the same problem that they're trying to solve, but it's that little penny drop moment, like, oh, hang on, this is kind of, is this a similar sort of situation to the main one? So you can feed it back again, as well as giving them their spotlight moment. There was something else I was going to say, and it's completely gone now. It must have been a flip.
Right, and if you're running a one-shot, the thing about Cthulhu games in general, especially conventions, is that not here because everybody is at a super high level, but at a general sort of regional con, the shorthand is the D&D games are about hitting things, and the Cthulhu games are about talking to people and characterization. And so if you're preparing an investigative game, or whether it's literally Cthulhu or otherwise, the expectation of people, particularly at a con, is that they will get a chance to all do character-related things, or secondarily with Cthulhu also to interact with cool period stuff. And so if you kind of think of, in addition to your main investigative mystery, what the things on the side, what cool side moments that people might enjoy and might dig into, and then put little things on their character sheets that kind of direct them, kind of red flag the opportunity to go and have those interactions, that I think people will walk away from your table going, wow, I never expected to be able to go and talk to this person and do that. And that maybe that's what they really remember, whereas the mystery is sort of just the framework that lets them do that.
Yeah. That's reminded me what I was going to say, because obviously if you're writing for your group, or if you've been playing with them for a while, obviously you've got a fairly solid idea of the sorts of things they're going to react to, the sorts of things they're going to enjoy, so you will structure your plot around that and make sure that those opportunities are provided. When you're doing a convention game, it's a lot more difficult because, as Robbie said, apart from here, well, we pretty much know all of you now. We don't know who's going to turn up to the table. We don't know what their likes and dislikes are going to be, which is why I really like using pre-gens for convention games, because you can build those hooks in. You can give them those little interesting tidbits to involve them in the game and to give them their character moments. Whereas if you're doing sort of like character creation before you start the mystery, even if you try to gently nudge people in the right direction, you could still end up with a disconnect that means that it's going to be harder for them to invest and get themselves involved in that plot.
Considering you're authors, designers, and publishers, this probably sounds like a promotional setup.
I haven't met this gentleman before.
We can talk about a kickback later, but what would each of you, maybe one each, the published adventure that you would say does this investigative thing best? It doesn't have to be your own work, it doesn't have to not be your own work. Like if I wanted to go read some adventures that do this all really well, what would you put on the list?
Well, the one we've already talked about, which is the Fathomless Leap from Cthulhu Confidential, I think is a great, if I do say so myself, example of how to create a really clear mystery that feels like a particular mystery genre and has all sorts of elements and moving parts in it. And one of the reasons I pick a one-to-one thing is that it allows you to have the player do things that they would never. There's a big moment at the end where in a group of investigators, there's a thing that would never happen in a group of investigators, and it's not guaranteed that it will happen, that the investigator will find themselves in this position, but every time I've run it, everyone does.
Yeah.
And it really feels like a noir mystery in a way that it wouldn't if they're
In a group game, yeah.
in a group game. Don't do that. Why?
Yeah.
And they would be able to arrange things so they didn't have to do that. So I think that's what I would put forward as my own personal, best version of the investigative scenario.
Yeah, I think it's a really solid choice. Like you said, it's really evocative of the setting, but also it really captures the essence of what an investigative game should be. It has a very clear mystery that needs to be solved, but it's not at all clear from the outset what the outcome is. It doesn't feel in any way linear. It feels like it's set in Los Angeles in the 1930s. And you really feel like you have all of LA to play with. Like, it could be anyone. There are directions that you can go and investigate, but it's not at all clear where you start or who's responsible. And it is really nicely structured. I also we do a thing every January now. We started doing called New Game Master Month, where so it's us, and I think Chaosium were in it last year as well, and Atlas Games and Monty Cook Games, and we all kind of try and get together and we just put forward one of our adventures, and we support new GMs through running one of our adventures. And it's a really nice initiative, and the adventure that we've used for that is it's called Midnight Sub Rosa, and it's by a writer called Ruth Tillman, and it's just a really I like that as an introductory kind of investigative adventure, because it's very it's straightforward enough that it doesn't have the complexity of Robin's Cthulhu Confidential adventure, but it's still doesn't feel linear. It's still got a lot kind of an open world kind of feel to it, because it's set in a small town, so you do feel like you can investigate anyone in that small town. And again, it's not clear where it's not immediately obvious who the responsible parties are, but equally it's quite pared back for new GMs. So it's a very approachable and very accessible kind of good example of an investigative mystery.
Yeah, I think I'm contractually obligated to mention Masks of Nyarlathotep, obviously. If you want big, sprawling ones, that's definitely one to go for. But as Kat was saying, the ones I'm going to big up really are the short 1 hour demo games that we've done. So one of my personal favourites is Necropolis, which will be coming out in Gateways to Terror, which is a collection of 3 very short introductory games, because it was a convention scenario. It was designed to be fast, to distill down to the core elements of, here's a little bit of investigation, oh God, there's a thing that's trying to eat your face off, quick run if you can, kind of thing. And I'm very fond of that one. And also Lightless Beacon, which we did for We Are All Us Day last week, again, because that's one that's got a little bit more scope built into it. If you want to expand it out, there are other elements that you can bring in, but at its core, here's a lighthouse, you are stuck on this island in this lighthouse, what's happening? And just those nice tight little games that have that distilled essence are always interesting to look at, because you can always make a big game, you can always make a scenario that's going to last you 3-4 hours, maybe 2 sessions, but distilling it down to the core essence to hit an hour, 90 minutes is actually, it's quite a tricky thing to do.
And especially while not making it feel linear as well.
Yes.
Often distilled down adventures like that, it's pretty clear going in, like who's responsible. So yeah.
And this sort of brought to mind another point, which is that we think of investigative scenarios as always being sort of murder mysteries or crime dramas. Who killed this person? Where is this person who has disappeared? And or what ate this person, and those all intertwine. But there are all sorts of other things that you can structure as an investigative mystery in order to shift things around a bit, but still have people using their deduction ability and their information. So it can be, someone has been kidnapped and you're trying to find the location where they're at, or there's a weird stellar anomaly causing a strange effect. How do we find how to shut that down? Or I know what the monster is from the beginning because the scenario starts with us being attacked by deep ones. How do we find the special knife that sends all the deep ones back into the ocean? And so you can one of the sort of things about early Cthulhu adventures is they both established the template, but then after a while they started to fall back on some fairly common devices, like the famous uncle you never previously knew about who has deeded you the property of his new mansion or whatever.
It could also be, just to add to that, it could also be, where did the money go, or where did this item go, like a family heirloom that disappeared or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's not Cthulhu related or mythos related, but there is a beautiful game which is based on Columbo. I can't remember the guy's name. It's for free, you can go get it, and it's a two-person game, and it is really beautifully structured around the whole idea of yes, from the outset who the bad guy is. You've just got to catch them and prove it.
Yeah.
And it is beautifully structured around that. So if that's the sort of thing you enjoy, I will find out the details if you want them and pass them on, but that is a really nice way of just playing with the formula.
Mm-hmm.
So a one-on-one would be a good way to get comfortable with running an investigative game for multiple players, or because it's so different it doesn't really help that much?
If you have a choice, go with multi first, and then go to one-to-one, because one-to-one is very rewarding, but also very challenging for both.
Yeah, I think it very much depends on the person. I think that, certainly a thing that we found with our one-to-one games is that it's been really good for new players. So it's really helped new players feel a lot more comfortable who maybe might not be as comfortable in a group setting, or as comfortable speaking out or kind of articulating their opinion or whatever in a group setting. Whereas for a GM, I think it's a lot more pressured. I think it's kind of but then in saying that, if you're playing with somebody that you know very, very well, they're going to give you a lot of emotional support anyway, in terms of kind of GMing that. So it is a kind of I guess, an easier way in some ways, because you are only managing one person's expectations and one person's ideas and one person's, play. Whereas in a group game, you're trying to kind of make sure that everyone at the table is getting spotlight time, and there are other kind of concerns that come into it with a group game.
Yes, that goes to the incredible variability of the role-playing experience.
Yeah.
And it's all depends on who you've got, right?
Yeah.
A group of very supportive players could be your best start, or a group of kind of people who need a lot of wrangling could be an extra challenge, right?
Yeah.
So,
any advice about, because I don't run Call of Cthulhu games, but RuneQuest, but I like the investigative adventures. So any idea of how to tailor this to a world where people have access to divination and, speak with ancestors who have the information, etc. So how to make it more challenging in an environment where finding clues is really easier?
So there's sort of two issues with a fantasy world investigation, and these are things that our colleague Gar tackled with a product called Lorefinder, where you kind of have to go through the available spells and find where their limits and rules are. So, for example, a divination spell in the world of RuneQuest will get you your god's opinion about what's going on, but that's not that. So that might move you in a direction towards something. But then, if you have to prove you have to prove that they've done it, and you say, "Well, I performed a divination," and then the people in there said, "Well, we performed a divination too, and we got a totally different result." So you have to look at is it a world where divination is 100% reliable, or everybody chooses to believe it? and also in a fantasy world, there are even if the designer hasn't included it, logically there are magical wards against scrying and so forth. So, of course, the vault that you need to look into, you check in. Oh, it has a high resistance. Oh, you didn't get through the thing. You didn't see what was in there. All you saw was a weird void, blank sort of situation. So, and another thing is just that the rules have to be really well known to everybody, because in a magical world, divination, big deal. We do that all the time. And the limits of that, or other spells. So, in a game called Mutant City Blues, which is a superhero police procedural, we play with the idea that all the superpowers come from a single source, and it's been long enough that forensic science, to the extent that forensic science is a real thing, has grown up around that. So you can go, oh, well, wasn't an ordinary fire. This fire was set with a superpower, and that becomes part of it, but it all becomes part of the logic.
And that's it, it's maintaining that logic. Is there a way that you can still have your mystery? I mean, this is the interesting thing with mysteries. If you go back and you watch old mysteries, from TV mysteries from the 50s and 60s and even the 70s, so back to my favourite Columbo, a lot of those plots wouldn't work now because of modern surveillance technology and everybody having a phone that tells people exactly where you are. So, but it's not like people suddenly stopped writing mysteries. So there's always a way around it. You just might have to be a little bit more creative about it. And there will be a way. And as Robin said, divination is not necessarily 100% accurate. It's somebody's opinion. I mean, one of the other things is like, the people that the characters are talking to don't necessarily have to tell the truth if they're trying to protect their... That's why you have things like psychology roles and insight and goodness knows what else. Because, NPCs have agendas too. Obviously, don't be an idiot about it. Don't be deliberately obstructive to your players trying to get information that they need. But, they're not necessarily, NPCs aren't necessarily going to spill their guts about everything they know the first time they meet the investigators just because the investigators have rocked up and asked them nicely. Or not, as the case may be. So, you can sort of like gently feed out information in bits and bots to just sort of develop atmosphere and get around certain weird, interesting structural elements of games.
And just to add to that, in that case though, I would let the players know that that's what you're doing, because we have a GM who does that kind of thing, and he complained later, like, why didn't you go back to the palace? And we said, because we were turned away. Yes, because you asked the guard there once. And you didn't give the proper credit, but you could have gone back, and he didn't give us any hint about that.
I mean, that's it. Always leave the door open. So don't close the door by doing that, because that's a bad thing to do. But again, it's
like it's giving that you might need to build a relationship before you get the valuable information.
Yeah. As a seasoned investigator, there must be another way past his emotional defenses.
Yeah, in Gumshoe, like we have a clue type, which is called a pipe clue, and that's basically laying pipe for something, like Lynn's example, for something that will happen later in the adventure. So you kind of say, oh, well, the first time you go to the castle, you get rebuffed, but you're pretty sure that there's something going on there. Maybe it's worth finding another way or whatever. And like with your question, we get asked that a lot. We have a skill or an ability in Gumshoe called assess honesty. And
or bullshit detector.
Or a bullshit detector, and people kind of go, well, isn't that game breaking? I mean, if people just know automatically, the information, then that's no fun. But the way it tends to play out is that people, you might know somebody's lying, but you don't necessarily know what they're lying about, right? So, they might say to you, oh yeah, no, I definitely wasn't there that night. But not because they're the murderer, but because they're having an affair with somebody and they were somewhere else, so there are other things that people can be, again, like following up on the kind of subplots, there's other things going on in the world apart from that one thing that your players are focused on, and NPCs have different motivations and things as well. So, partial information, like Lynn said, like if you do a divination spell, you're not going to get all of the information about it,
And the RuneQuest equivalent of that would be detect chaos. It's like, I detect chaos. I sense chaos. Well, that doesn't mean he's the source of this particular chaos.
Yeah.
It doesn't tell you anything. So it's also very fruitful then to think of these in terms of partial clues that get you part of the way to where you're going. It's like, we talked to the guy at the gate and we had a sense something was funny. That person seemed to be lying, but I don't know about what. We're going to have to find out whether the lie was pertinent. We know he's a chaos cultist, but is he the chaos cultist, or is this even a chaos thing? I think we have one more time before the clue that it's dinner time sinks in.
Well, yeah, although, yes, because it's the bell has gone, and it's more a case of all the gannets will have just descended and eaten everything.
I'd love plenty of examples, if at all possible, of how to avoid railroading your players. Because the one scenario I was running for my guys, I wasn't fast enough on my feet to realize that the end of this particular chapter was very railroady. And my players, just as a unit, just like, wait, this happens, why? We don't understand. I'd love lots of different examples. Not to do that again.
And hopefully, skilled developers have prevented that from getting through to publication.
Yeah.
I think that one way to do it is, as you're reading your prepared scenario, is to go through it with that in mind and check each scene and make a little railroad tie mark on the side and go, wait a minute, ask yourself in each scene as you read it, what choice do the players have here? And if it suddenly turns into a screenplay where it's telling you what the players are doing, or look for the telltale words, and then the villain escapes to reappear later, it's like, does this game have rules? Because I suspect the players will use those rules to possibly prevent that villain from escaping. And so look for those telltale errors that should never have gone through publication, and then you have to find a way to add a choice to it so that it preserves the story without railroading.
Yeah, I think Robin and I have a disagreement about the effectiveness of a scene clue diagram, which is a tool that we use in Gumshoe games to plot out a game. It's basically you make a map of all of the different scenes and the clues that are in that scene, and then you can kind of see the way the information is flowing. So I found it really useful for me as a kind of a lesser experienced GM to just be able to tell where in the adventure I am, but also to look at how the information flows through the adventure. So if you map something out in terms of like the clues in the scene, and it comes out in a straight line, scene after scene after scene, with one scene leading into just one other scene, then you know from just looking at it that it's going to be a linear and railroaded adventure. Like if the players don't feel like they have agency, and if they don't feel like the choices that they make are meaningful, then it's not going to be engaging and it's not going to be interesting for them. Whereas if you have more of a kind of a branching, kind of almost a diamond-shaped mapping, where you start off at one point, you have your introductory scene, and then it spreads out and there are multiple different scenes that they can get the information, and then kind of filters back into a point at the other side where you get to your conclusion, your kind of denouement. Then it's going to feel really meaningful. There's going to be a lot of choice in it for the players. So I find that personally really useful in terms of understanding how the information flows through the.
I've now had enough people come up and say they like scene flow diagrams that I don't submit. So my issue with them is if they're badly designed, it makes the adventure look overwhelming and confusing instead of solving that problem. But it turns out the answer is just hire graphic designer Christian Knudsen to redesign your crappy scene flow diagram so that it looks good.
But again, it's what you're saying. Some people process information visually, so something like that really works for them. They don't work for me, that I just look at them and just go, that's not how my brain works. So it's one of these things where you have to, through trial and error, unfortunately, find the thing that does work for you to allow to spot this. It may be that just bullet points work for you, figuring out what is and isn't there. But it's going back again to what we were saying about consistency of your plot. It's like always examine your plot for leaps of logic. Is there a genuine way that the investigators could have figured that out? It's not just a case of, you're here now because you need to be, because plot.
Yeah.
Is there a genuine pathway that led them to this point rather than plot expediency?
And in addition to railroading, a thing that you may need to look at when you're reviewing a scenario you're going to run is there may be vast chunks of information where the scenario writer has not answered the question, how did they get this information? You'll, for example, a character, you might get an extensive character history but that character would never tell them, and how do they find that out? How do they? And the answer is not to necessarily throw the scenario over your shoulder, but go, oh, well, they could find this out by talking to this other person, and build in the choices and informational pathways that the writer and developer forgot to put in.
Yeah, and it is quite often because you've written the game, you know what those connections are, but if you're writing it down for somebody else, you kind of forget that you need to put those in because the other person running it is not in your head and doesn't know what's in there. You do have a tendency to fill in blanks that you aren't aware of if it's something you've written yourself and you're running for people that you know.
Because an investigative scenario has two logic trains going at each other, which is you have to figure out what are the logical steps that the antagonists took to enact their plan, and unless they're members of the Trump administration, their plan makes sense. And then the other direction is what is the logical series of steps that the investigators will undertake in order to unravel that. And so the logic has to work in both ways. So it's a very challenging, perhaps the most challenging form of scenario writing and role-playing, which is why people actually buy scenarios for investigative games when they don't buy them for D&D, because it's easy to put a room full of spiders next to a room full of gnolls, but it's much harder to figure out why the gnolls enacted a complex financial scheme to defraud the spiders.
And I think following on from that as well, you need to understand that those trails are both moving all the way through your adventure. So again, in Gumshoe, we have a thing called antagonist reactions, which are scenes where we flag up explicitly what the antagonists in the adventure are doing while the players are progressing through the adventure. So, you can think of it in terms of like a timeline. Like if the players don't investigate this thing before this date, then the antagonists will advance on their plot or their plan another aspect. So if you are running a pre-written adventure and you get close to the end and it does suddenly feel very linear, very railroaded, you can always kind of build in antagonist reactions and go, well, what would the antagonists actually be doing at this point in the game? Is there a way that they can come back into it and, do something else to move off the
because if they're aware that your investigators are interfering, they're not just going to sit there
and
let
sit
them
there
do
and wait
it.
for them to
They're
do it.
going to take action.
Absolutely.
We went to a lot of effort to defraud those spiders. Well, I think on that note, we can thank everybody for coming and posing your fabulous questions. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.